Russia issued a direct threat to Britain tonight saying it will not forget support for Ukraine and warning of tough retaliation. It came after isolated tyrant Vladimir Putin raged that Western sanctions against his regime are like a declaration of war. Putin also chillingly hinted at a nuclear strike if NATO forces got involved, saying it would have colossal and catastrophic consequences not only for Europe but also the whole world. His rambling comments while talking to air stewardesses was broadcast on state media, which is banned from reporting how his invasion has stalled against a brave Ukrainian resistance. He used the appearance to lash out at the crippling sanctions and asset freezes targeting Russian banks and Putin's oligarch cronies. These sanctions that are being imposed are akin to a declaration of war, but thank God it has not come to that, the president said. Later his foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova issued a sinister threat to the UK. She said, Russia will not forget Britain's desire to cooperate with ultranationalist forces in Ukraine and the supply of British weapons to the Kiev regime. The sanctions hysteria in which London plays one of the leading, if not the main, roles, leaves us no choice but to take proportionately tough retaliatory measures. London has made a final choice of open confrontation with Russia. The Kremlin also vowed to impose sanctions of its own which would undermine British interests in Russia. Western nations are going after the mobster leader's money and his oligarch pals as they attempt to cut off Russia's cash flow. While Russia is battered at home economically, Putin's forces are also seeing themselves getting beaten back in Ukraine. Kiev today claimed their defense forces have now killed or captured more than 10,000 Russian soldiers. And that is along with reportedly destroying 269 tanks, 945 armored vehicles and 79 planes and helicopters. Russia has repeatedly raised the specter of war with the West, with Putin's top diplomat this week warning World War III would be nuclear and destructive. But Putin once again defended his twisted invasion, trotting out his warped explanation that the country needs to be demilitarized and denazified. He threatened that if Ukraine continues behave in the same way, it brings into question the future of its statehood, suggesting the complete annexation of the nation by Russia. Putin also said that any country that sought to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be considered by Moscow to have joined the war. Any movement in this direction will be considered by us as participation in an armed conflict by that country, said Putin. Russia's tyrannical leader, who has had near absolute power for 2 decades, also insisted he won't be declaring martial law. Dissent over the invasion is growing at home as Russia becomes increasingly isolated due to the sanctions. Vlad, who has been branded demented by experts, was speaking to flight attendants in comments broadcast on state television. NATO and Western officials have repeatedly insisted they will not impose a no-fly zone, despite pressure from Kiev. President Volodymyr Zelensky has raged that the lack of a no-fly zone was putting blood of the hands of the West. In a bitter speech on Friday night he renewed his call, telling NATO that all the people who die from this day forward will also die because of you. However, the defensive alliance has repeatedly refused to do so, over fears it would prompt an all-out war with nuclear-armed Russia. Zelensky also renewed his plea for help on a call joined by U.S. senators, telling them he needs more planes and drones to fight against Putin. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Poland to meet with the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. The visit comes a day after he attended a NATO meeting in Brussels in which the alliance pledged to step up support for Eastern Flank members. And elsewhere, the UN Security Council will hold an open meeting Monday on the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Russia's invasion continues to grind forward, including breaching a ceasefire to shell civilians in Mariupol. But it has been at much slower pace than expected, as their forces are blighted by logistical and supply problems. Children have been killed in his indiscriminate bombing campaigns, which have allegedly used weapons such as cluster munitions and vacuum bombs. Putin however earlier denied bombing Ukrainian civilians despite overwhelming evidence showing the horrors of his invasion. Vlad's bizarre denial comes as he claimed the war he unleashed has been a success, despite the Russian army suffering heavy losses. Russia today insisted there would be a ceasefire, only for his forces to then restart shelling of a humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol. Ukrainian officials had hoped to evacuate some 200,000 civilians. The Russians are continuing to bomb us and use artillery. It is crazy, Mariupol Deputy Mayor Suri Orlov. There is no ceasefire in Mariupol and there is no ceasefire all along the route. Our civilians are ready to escape but they cannot escape under shelling. Moscow blamed Ukrainian nationalists for the breakdown of the ceasefire. Mariupol has been one of the most brutalized cities of war as the Russians have blockaded it and cut off food, water, heating and transport in the depths of water. It has been compared to the Nazi blockade of Leningrad in World War II. Moscow has seized two key cities in its 10-day-long invasion, Berdyansk and Kherson on Ukraine's southern coast along the Black Sea. Peace talks had been expected to continue today, but Ukraine remains defiant as civilians prepare to fight back. Putin is believed to have thought he could roll over Ukraine within just 48 hours, and his forces thought they would be met as heroes. But instead, they have found themselves bogged down against a staunch resistance. Moscow, however, is believed to be growing frustrated, and it is feared Putin could resort to ever more brutal tactics as the war drags on. Kiev is believed to remain the prime objective for the Russians, and a massive convoy of armored vehicles has been lurking nearby, apparently preparing for a protracted siege. However, mystery surrounds the so-called convoy of death as it hasn't made any significant progress for days. Russian forces are believed to be being increasingly demoralized, with captured troops seen crying for their mums. Ukraine, despite its defiance, is facing a humanitarian crisis with more than 1 million refugees fleeing the devastating war. President Zelensky, who has remained in a bunker in Ukraine, dodging assassination attempts, has called for a face-to-face meeting with Putin to try and end the destruction. Meanwhile, Professor Anthony Glees, an expert on security and intelligence, said Western spooks should now ruthlessly target Putin's circle. He told The Sun, "To do what Putin is doing you have to be demented, and I think he is. And if we're thinking it, there will be people in the army, the FSB, SVR and GRU who will be thinking the same thing. We know from history that the only way you can get rid of an authoritarian dictator is through military defeat in war or by encouraging the armed forces to revolt. We should begin to think about what we could offer the Russian generals, and we could start by offering them the oligarchs' luxury yachts. There's no limits to what we could use to induce them. Those around Putin are killers, they are like SS officers of old. But there will be serious commanders and generals who have doubts.